Big businesses look to us for specialist insurance solutions. Do you? Over 80 of the top 100 JSE-listed companies trust us to protect their businesses.
Good day and welcome to the Role of Insurance series with myself, Fifi Peters. This is a series that places the microscope on the different sectors within the insurance space and what external factors influence insurance risks. In today's episode, we are looking at the concepts of broad form liability insurance with a specific focus on product recall. The experts joining me for this discussion are Manisha Chiman, Underwriting Head of Liability, Professional Indemnity and Construction at SHA, which is a division of Santam, as well as Walter Grant, Manager of Liability, Technical and Operational at SHA. To the both of you, thanks so much for joining the program. Manisha, to begin with you, what exactly do we mean by broad form liability, particularly as it does pertain to product liability and product recall?
Thanks so much, Fifi, for having us. So in terms of broad form liability, if we go really down back to basics, what is broad form? Broad form is there to cover commercial entities against their legal liability to third parties for third-party injury or third-party property damage. Now, that is really the operational side of a client's business. What you also have is what we call completed operations. So, for example, they've actually produced a product that reaches end consumer, and the end consumer consumes those goods and might, experience salmonella or food poisoning. And that is what would be covered under product liability. Again, it's third-party injury or property damage. As part of the coverage, what we also include is what we call products recall. Now, products recall, the trigger is quite different. It is still an injury and damage component to a third party, but here it's the likelihood of injury and damage. So, for example, the insured, being a manufacturer of goods, they discover that their product might have some contaminants or might not have listed a possible allergen on a box. That could potentially open them up to a product liability claim. They then need to recall the goods, and that's where products recall comes in.
Walter, just to get your thoughts here, how pronounced has product recall been in the recent past? I mean, we've seen quite a number of cases happening in the food or the fast-moving consumer goods sector, for instance, one or two in manufacturing. But talk to us about the space presently, what is happening in the space and how pronounced product recalls are.
Thank you very much. So we have definitely seen an uptake in the number of products recall claims that are being made against our policies. This started off during the 2017-2018 very famous listeriosis case, but we have seen a gradual increase into other sectors of the food and beverage industry. For instance, in 2021, one of the largest food producers in South Africa recalled approximately 20 million canned vegetable food items from the shelves, costing them approximately 700 million rand. And we also saw one of the larger confectionery manufacturers who had to recall contaminated chocolate due to the risk of glass shards being found in the final product. Now, these types of claims are not limited to the food and beverage industry only. We have also seen a definite increase in the number of recall claims in respect of the automotive industry, as well as technology brands such as Fitbits. So SHA on an annual basis conducts a risk review in which we engage with our brokers and our clients to see what their take on their risk exposure is. And it was interesting to note that product recall only rated 6 when they had to rate their threats.
And why, Walter, do you think that is the case? Why is this form of risk not being ranked so highly? And is this unique to South Africa, or is this how product recall risk is received and perceived elsewhere in the world?
So I think the largest reason why it is not being taken as seriously as it should is simply due to the fact that the clients do not necessarily understand the extent of their own exposures. There is a misconception that, in the event that a recall needs to occur, the original manufacturer or the final retailer of a product will be the one footing the bill for such a recall, when in fact, in terms of the Consumer Protection Act, any player along the supply line can be called upon to recall the product from the shelf in the event that there's a likelihood of injury or damage. We have also definitely, so that is the landscape as we see it in South Africa, but even globally, we have definitely seen an uptake in the purchasing of products recall cover due to the fact that many more claims are being made in the space and the quantum of those claims are getting higher and higher. The reality is that these types of claims draw greater attention due to the fact that the insured party needs to advertise the fact that these goods now need to be recalled. And that type of awareness really has prompted our clients to purchase higher limits and to purchase the cover if they had not had it before.
Just given the fact that there's so many parties that are accountable when it does come to the product recall process, not necessarily just the manufacturer or the end retailer, but everyone else who plays along the value chain, as Walter has spelled out for us, who then exactly needs this kind of cover?
So I think, you mentioned fast-moving goods, consumer goods. That's a really good place to start. But, anywhere from anyone in the manufacturing chain to pharmaceuticals, clothing companies. And I know when I say clothing companies, people are going, she's probably talking nonsense, because why would clothing companies need to recall? And that could be because fabrics could be mistreated, and as a result, you can have allergic reactions. More than that, equipment companies, and the one that I really do want to mention is packaging companies. With the advent of COVID and just going through this process of the pandemic, business are diversifying, and so most companies now also outsource their packaging, or they might be taking up packaging of third-party goods. If you're a packager of a third-party good, you are actually in the supply chain, and so you could actually have a risk exposure if your packaging contaminates the product inside. So that in itself poses a risk exposure. When you think about products recall, you think, where do you fit in the supply chain? You need to think about, is there potential for your product to be defective to the end user? That poses a risk. And are you vulnerable to contamination? So in the example of the packaging, if the bottles, for example, are not sterilized properly, could I contaminate whatever is being filled inside? That in itself will inform your decision to purchase products recall, and if you are susceptible to a products recall claim.
Mm-hmm. Just, Manisha, briefly, in terms of where you lie then on the value chain, does that affect what kind of products recall cover you take out, or is it broadly the same? Is it broadly a one-size-fits-all approach here?
I think it does depend, right? Product recall policies, when we do talk about products recall, this can vary. It's very important in the insurance industry. If you're a consumer of products recall coverage, so as an insured, what type of coverage are you purchasing? And in the insurance policies, so under the SHA policy, what I can talk about is that there are 3 triggers. There's the first party recall cover, which in our instance here, if you're the if you're the manufacturer, the end user, or you're the retailer, you're going to need first party coverage. If you are a third-party trigger, so third-party trigger could be that I'm producing a component that goes into another product, you might want to only purchase the third-party product, because the likelihood of that trigger being put forward is more on the retailer side than it is on my side as just a component manufacturer. And it will also come down to the contract conditions between yourself and your supply chain. So contracts really play a critical role in denoting where the trigger would actually come through and who's responsible for the recall. One of the things that we must be aware of, though, as South Africans, is that we have quite a beautiful and interesting consumer protection legislation. And the National Consumer Commissioner actually can trigger a recall. So if he feels or she feels that it's absolutely necessary that this product is unsafe for the consumers, they would trigger that recall. And what we have is the third trigger under recall policy, which is the legislative trigger.
All right. So then, Walter, come in here and talk to us then about the various triggers, the first party, the third party, as well as the government triggers. So now, in an event that a product recall is triggered by either party, How exactly does the cover work, and what are the differences?
So thank you very much for that. So as we said, now the purpose of the product recall policy is to retrieve all the goods that either have caused damage or injury or are likely to cause injury or damage. And that is a very key fact for our customers to understand, is even in the event that your product has not yet caused third-party injury or damage, the likelihood of that event occurring is enough to trigger the section. So as Manisha mentioned, under our policy, there are three possible ways to trigger the section. First being first-party recall. That would be an instance where the insured themselves have identified that there is a potentially unsafe component to the product that they have manufactured, and they would then initiate the recall to get the product back out of the market. Third-party recall, being our second trigger, would be in instances where your insured's product is incorporated into a third-party product, which is then sold onto market. If that third-party product detects that there was a problem with the product that was incorporated into theirs, and that could potentially cause third-party property damage or injury, then they are entitled to initiate a recall on your behalf and recover those costs from you as the insured. The final one, as Manisha mentioned, would be government recall. So this would be instances where the legislative authorities mandate certain companies to recall products from the shelf. The listeriosis would be a perfect example of that, where the National Consumer Commission instructed various companies to recall their products in order to prevent further third-party injury.
Walter, I'm wondering then what role your industry plays in making the process a lot simpler for your clients. Just talk to us about the role of insurers here.
So the role of an insurer in the process of a product recall is, before we provide the cover, we will go through an insured's recall processes that they have in place to make sure that if we are providing the cover, they have the necessary protocols and procedures in place, so that in the event that a recall is to happen, that the insured is in the best position possible to execute that recall. So the National Consumer Commission provides a guideline with regard to what steps a supplier is supposed to take in the event that a recall is to occur. And those obligations would be summarized and contained in what we call a recall plan. Now, that recall plan is fundamentally the operating document which sets out exactly who needs to be doing what at what stage. So that, because when a recall starts to happen, it happens quick, it happens fast. The faster you can get on top of it, the lower the cost implication of such a recall would be. So factors that you would include in your recall plan would be such as who is authorized to initiate a recall, the roles and responsibilities of the various players within the company, the details of how to trace the affected products. And this is something that we look at very critically. In the event that a recall were to occur, would the insured be able to identify the problematic batches? And would they be able to recall those specifically from their clients? It would also set out details regarding any regulatory announcements that need to be made in order to make the public aware, as well as any communications to other third parties, media outlets, relevant government officials, and the like. So one of the most important factors and one of the most important steps that an insured can take in order to ensure that they are prepared for a recall scenario would be to conduct mock recalls. So what is a mock recall? It is a realistic and challenging scenario-based exercise that tests the recall plans, procedures, and protocols of the recall team within a company. The recall will consider bespoke scenarios based on the client's specific activities and their products to fully challenge them and their team to perform a recall as if it were happening in real time. That will enable them to test the efficacy of both the recall plan as well as the recall team that they have in place. As mentioned earlier, we conduct the risk review on an annual basis, and what we found concerning is that approximately a third of companies that have recall plans in place have never tested these recall plans.
All right.
And as such, in the event that one were to occur, they would not be in a position to see whether or not their recall plans and staff are efficiently trained.
I want to circle back to the this particular cover and exactly how it works, and also the complexity of the product recall process, specifically, Manisha, as it also does pertain to companies who have quite a number of their goods sold and exported elsewhere. A lot of South African companies, global companies, quite diversified in which markets they operate. And I'm wondering whether that makes the product recall process that much more cumbersome, and therefore what kind of cover is put in place here for exporters, and what that also potentially means for pricing.
That is a great question, and I think you asked something about what could our industry do differently, or what is our industry doing, around this. So for us, I think the very big basic is the intermediary interaction, right? So the broker market plays an absolutely critical role in unpacking the client's risk exposure, especially when it comes to product recall. And, when it comes to South African companies, we are growing. And so we are partnering and we are exporting with international brands or internationally. And so as a recall underwriter, a critical aspect would be, where are we exporting to? And does the client actually understand the legislation where they're exporting to? Because if I take, for example, Europe has its own set of consumer protection laws. How does, what do they deem triggers a recall under their legislation? And it's important that clients sort of unpack that with their broker, and also in terms of the policy wording, what are they covered for versus what risk they are embarking on. Adding to this complexity, we spoke earlier about contract management. Very interesting one is contract management, because contracts are absolutely essential to noting the relationship between the two parties. And so if I am supplying a global entity that's taking my product to Europe, who is responsible for the recall if it's triggered overseas? And, for what amount? Have I limited my liability? You do find in instances, a great example is, the contract value is only R1 million, for example, but I have signed on for €5 million responsibility. And that's actually in the contract that I need to have so much cover. So you need to understand the impact on you financially as well. The complexity of your product plays a big role. So let's go back to that clothes example. Clothes are high volume. The distribution network could be vast. And that can actually play into the costing of the product recall. But if I take it a step backwards and go, what is low volume? It could be specialized machinery. So I'm building 2 or 3 of a kind and I'm exporting it off to Europe. But the machinery used to transport that particular machine back to South Africa could be complex in its very nature, contributing to the cost allocation. Costing is, the indication for costing and pricing of recall really comes down to the insured. Is a limit too much? Like, what limit is too much? What limit is too little? Nobody can tell you that besides you as a business. And that's where the whole mock recall comes into play. Because when you undertake a mock recall exercise, and we'll go into a little bit more detail what that entails, and I think Walter touched on it, it's about the challenge of it. One of the things we always say is, like, when you undertake a mock recall, it's always told to sit there with your policy, because a mock recall will include complex costs like transportation, disposal, media announcements, not just what the batch size is. So it's not just about the cost of, well, I put out, bottles of mineral water, and if that particular batch size was 20,000 rand, so that's the cost of the recall. No, your cost actually goes into your media campaigns, the call centers that one has to set up to ensure that the public has a form of communication with the manufacturer, as well as the transport companies. And when you hone that all in, there's an aspect of this cost that is actually uninsurable, and that is your reputational risk. How you handle a recall and the savvy with which you interact with the consumers, ensuring that they have all the information at their disposal, they can contact helplines, that can actually impact your business in the long tail, for which there is really no price that one can put to it.
I'm really interested in the different laws and the different treatments of a product recall in different jurisdictions. And I imagine that perhaps it also adds quite a thick layer of complexity for your industry. And I'm wondering whether there are conversations on, moving towards more harmonized laws as it does come does pertain to product recall. What can you tell us there about what is happening in that legal space?
I think it's a highly complex area, right? Understanding the different laws and the different languages has a huge impact. One of the basic forms I can say to you is if you look at the European Union and the class actions that potentially are opening up and how their laws all interact, you need to actually unpack that with the lawyer. It's absolutely essential to do so if you're going to embark into a relationship with a company. They understand the legislation you are going into. If it's francophone countries, what language is your contract denoted in? If you don't understand your own contract, what are you signing? The legal landscape in this space can be costly because when you're going to trigger something like a recall with overseas exports, potentially you have to run maybe 2 legal teams to ensure that the South African entity is fully aware of it. And so you want to go with global firms. That has a cost implication in terms of your insurer. So the insurer bears that cost. It could form part of the insurance. But more than that, when it comes to contract management, often we see, insurers tell us we have standardized contracts, which is great. We love to hear that you've got good contract management, it's standardized. But when you are exporting, using a standard contract might not be sufficient. Your contracts really should denote the relationship that you have with that party and really kind of limit and expressly state what you are responsible for. From a pricing perspective, I think product recall cover, and maybe this is also part of why people don't always engage on it, they do see it as being an exceptionally expensive cover. But I think our experience has shown that there's no limit too large that can be exhausted through product recalls, whether it's nationwide or even if it's international. There's just so much more uninsured risk by not actually investigating and interrogating this aspect with your brokers. So yeah, I think, today's day and age, do we have the funding as an individual business for me to actually take on this risk exposure also needs to be taken into account.
Mm-hmm. But Walter, just circling back to the conversation you were having, or the points that you raised on how the industry and clients can better prepare for this process. You were talking about the importance of having a product recall plan and actually simulating that plan with a mock kind of process. And you did highlight the fact that a lot of the clients that had been surveyed by SHA weren't really doing the mock recall exercises as frequently as they should. First of all, talk to us about why and how frequent such mock recall trials should be conducted.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so I think the reason that clients are not conducting these mock recalls as often as they should, it goes back to what we were saying earlier, in that the awareness of the client of the importance of these types of procedures is not necessarily at the level at which one would like it to be. Ideally, you would want to run a mock recall at least once a year, because as operations change, as your landscape changes, your suppliers change, your clients change. As these changes occur, it is important to ensure that your recall process is aligned to take these changes into account. Fundamentally, the insured's ability to successfully conduct a recall will have the biggest impact on the severity of a loss and the quantum that is finally being claimed against them. So going through these processes, sitting with your attorneys, drafting a proper recall plan which clearly delineates who is responsible for what, and conducting these mock recalls is of infinite worth. During these mock recalls, what you will also find is that recommendations can be made as to how the process can be approved, how your documents can be approved. And that ultimately could save you hundreds of millions of rands worth of liability down the line.
All right. Manisha, just lastly, reflect on the perspective of the consumer. I mean, in the instance where a product is recalled, I think at the weekend there was a particular a cup of soup manufacturer that initiated a recall. But what are your rights as a consumer who has either consumed this product or driven this product? or exercised with this product, and particularly if the consumption by the recalled product has caused you harm?
So I think it's absolutely essential to engage with the manufacturer, right? So the minute that a recall notice has been put out to market, to follow those details. Usually at a minimum, there will definitely be a contact line on there that will also help guide you as a consumer as to who you need to contact, and you can query the questions. In most instances, if the product has not been consumed, there is a bit of an exchange. So if you come to major retailers where the products are being sold, there might be an exchange of product. Alternatively, you are to provide the product, and there could be voucher or something to that effect where they will provide it to you. Product recall is also very specific. So we've talked about batch sizes. So you will find that they will actually note on there the batch size on which it's issued, and every product will have that on their labeling. It's the batch size and the date in which it was batched, as well as the expiry date. And so you will see that on the recall notice for you to come to have a look at it, and you can identify your products that then need to be taken to the stores. If you have suffered any sort of injury, or you need to immediately actually inform the manufacturers that you've actually consumed a product and that it was part of the batch size. So again, try and keep the wrappings, try and keep the product information so that you can talk to the manufacturers. And that's where you always have on your product, there's always a helpline on there that will say, please contact us. It's essential that you familiarize yourself with that and that you inform the manufacturer immediately. Mm-hmm. I think consumer awareness, Fifi, before I round off, I think just overall, South Africa is the consumer awareness has just become so much more. And as consumers, we do have lots of rights, and it's essential that we have an understanding of these rights and that we use the right platforms and forums to actually engage with these manufacturers so that we remove these products safely from the market and quickly.
Certainly. I mean, to the both of you, thank you. A fascinating conversation around Broadform liability and product recall, and to the point that you have made regarding the perception of it being quite a costly cover to take out. I think that when you look down the track and you look at the costs of actually having to undergo such a product recall process without such cover, not only the cost to a company's balance sheet, but also to its reputation, perhaps it definitely needs a rethink in terms of the market's current uptake of such cover. But to the both of you, thanks so much for your time. I'll leave it there. Manisha Chiman, the underwriting head of liability, professional indemnity and construction at SHA, which is a division of Santam, as well as Walter Grant, manager of liability, technical and operational at SHA. And that brings us to the end of today's series. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll do it again next time. Goodbye.
Risk management is at the heart of what we do. Our deep-rooted industry and technical expertise enable us to manage the unique risks your business faces.